Noah's flood is a very clear example of the judgment of God. But I challenge you to see something new in that today. Do you know it's also a picture of God's mercy and of his faithfulness? Consider, for example, Noah was in no way going to be able to go to collect a whole bunch of animals from all over, even if it's a regional flood, okay? Even if you don't believe it's a global flood and you think it's regional, how is Noah going to go around and collect 2 of every single type of animal in that entire region and be sure to get them all? He can't do that. And the scripture says that all the animals came and got on the boat like God told them to. So God's leading the animals in. He gave Noah an instruction, but he helped Noah obey. The next part of that says, and God shut them in. So Noah didn't close the door to the ark. God shut the door. Well, what does that mean for us? What it means is that if God gives you an instruction and he says, this is what you do to obey me, he's going to make it possible for you to obey him. He's not going to leave you floundering and up to your own devices. As long as you step forward in faith and in obedience, that's not about judgment. That's about mercy. That's about God seeing what we need and what we're not capable of doing and filling in those gaps in our lives. That's about God seeing that we're weak and insufficient, and he becomes our sufficiency. So what else might we learn from the flood about who God is? If you were to go and pick up the story of the flood in the Bible, not a children's storybook, one thing you might notice right away is that it seems awfully repetitive. It's like God says, go get all the animals. And then all the animals came. And God said that all the animals were going to be destroyed. And then all the animals are destroyed. Every single thing is in there 2, 3, 4 times. Well, the purpose of it is to help you remember. There's something important it's trying to communicate to you. We are supposed to hear that God said it and it happened. It's kind of like Genesis chapter 1, where we were talking about the power of God's word making things happen. In this case, it's about God's faithfulness, because he said everything would be destroyed, and so it was. He said Noah would be saved, and so they were. He always comes through on what he said he would come through on. Well, here's another interesting fact you'll miss in a children's storybook, but that you'll get when you read the scripture. The first verse of chapter 8 says, and God remembered Noah. You see, this is after the floodwaters have covered the earth, and they're just sitting out there, the only thing left that they know of. And God remembers. That doesn't mean God forgot. He never forgets. It means that he is ready to follow through on his promise now. He promised them they would be safe. He promised they would have a future, and he'd make a covenant with them. And so he remembers them, and he starts making changes. But those changes take time. First he remembers, then the floodwaters start to recede. And as those floodwaters are slowly receding, you start to begin to see the tips of the mountaintops. And only after that time does Noah start to send out the birds that I'm sure you remember from your stories. And after Noah sends out the birds and eventually the dove doesn't come back, then God says, okay, you can get out now. That's a long period of time. Floodwaters don't recede overnight. God remembers. God keeps his promises, but sometimes they take a little while to fulfill. Sometimes he's actively moving and we don't see it yet. When God remembered Noah in that ark and the floodwaters were coming down, Noah might not have been able to see any discernible difference. It's 15 cubits above the mountaintop, so it would go down 14 cubits. And to Noah, he wouldn't be able to see any difference whatsoever. He couldn't see God moving, but God was moving. So what's that mean for us? Well, it means that sometimes we may feel like God's slow in keeping his promises. We might feel like he's forgotten all about us, that we prayed this prayer, that we took a step of obedience, and yet we're sitting here in the middle of this mess, in the middle of this chaos, and we have no idea how to get out. And it's just like, okay, God, are you actually thinking about me right now, or did Noah might have had moments when he felt that way, but God didn't forget. And God hasn't forgotten about us. He always follows through. So once again, the flood is about God's faithfulness and his character. Here's an interesting thing about Noah that I think we should bring out. You remember Noah's a righteous man. This is what's said in chapter 6, and it's said again in chapter 7. Noah was righteous in his generation. So what can we learn about him? Is there anything we can see in Noah's life that we can apply to ours? Because if we want to pursue righteousness, and he was righteous, there must be something in here we can learn from. Well, in chapter 6, we learned that Noah walked with God. And as we talked about last time, that really suggests that he enjoyed God's company. He craved God's presence. He wanted to be with him. And that meant he found joy in the holiness of God himself. And that's what Enoch was like back when we looked at the genealogies. And that's what Adam was like before he ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And of course, that is what Jesus models to us later. So the first thing we can take about the righteousness of Noah and apply to ourselves is that we should ask ourselves, do we have joy in God's presence? Do we want to be with him? Are we burdened and hurt by the sin and the wickedness in our own lives, the way God was burdened and hurt at the violence of the earth? Or do we look just like our generation? Because Noah didn't look like his generation. And if we look just like ours, there might be something wrong. So Noah walked with God. What else did Noah do? Noah obeyed God. When God gave the instruction to build the ark, he did. When he said, get onto the ark and bring the animals with you, he did. He got onto the ark and he waited for God to close the door, as we just said. But you know what else he did? Even though Noah sent out all of those birds, first a raven and then 3 times a dove, he sent out these birds in order to determine whether or not it was safe to get off the ark. So even though he did all of that, he did not get off the ark until God said to. You see why it's important to read it in the Bible and not just in a children's storybook? Because you see, you might miss this nuance. We're told all of this stuff about Noah sending out the birds. And then it says, and then God said to Noah, get off the ark. Take your family, take the animals. It's safe to go. And only then did Noah leave. So that's what a righteous man is. Someone who wants to be with God. Someone who obeys God. And someone who waits for God's instruction before he sets foot into his next path. There's more, though. What did Noah do as soon as he got off the ark? Do you know? You might not remember this nuance, but Noah didn't have just 2 of every animal. The clean animals and the clean birds, clean means good for eating and good for sacrificing to God, those he had 7 of each. And this would have been his food source during this time of scarce resources right after this devastation from the flood. And so I think any of us would have immediately found a way to start putting those particular animals in pens and getting them fed and getting them bred so that they could potentially have food to eat within the next coming scarce resource times. But that's not what Noah did. The first thing he did was build an altar and give out of his scarcity to God. That's why it's called sacrifice. He's not giving out of his abundance. He's giving out of his scarcity, out of his poverty. And this is not just him saying thank you to God in some casual way. This is him giving out of trust. He trusts so much in God that when he says thank you, he gives God something he needs for his future because he knows that God is going to protect him because he's just seen it happen. It's not blind faith. He just watched as God took care of him and met every promise every step of the way. So Noah, a righteous man, places his trust in God's faithfulness. And he takes out of what he has those limited resources and he gives them to God. So what's this mean for us? Well, I think it means that When we are stepping out in obedience to God and in gratefulness to God, we are giving to Him out of whatever it is that's scarce for us. Doing something where we lean on Him and we trust Him with our futures. In those moments, we are following in the footsteps of a righteous man. For example, me on this channel. I personally was terrified before I got started, and I'm still very nervous. And I'm really only comfortable with it because I don't really have anybody watching yet. But I was strongly convicted that I needed to be here. And I finally said, okay, God, if I'm supposed to do this, I just have to let you take what I have. You know, and I have limited skills in this area, and I've limited experience in this area. I hardly know what I'm doing with video, and I've certainly never done a whole lot of preaching or Bible lesson teaching outside of Sunday school. So it's hard for me. That is my way of giving out of my scarcity, because I have to trust God with the results of this. I can't force it. I can't make it work. But He will make it do whatever it's supposed to. I'm trusting Him with the future of this channel. And what is it for you? I mean, there must be something in your life, whether it is trusting Him with your financial future, trusting Him with the use of a particular gift that you have, trusting Him with a relationship. I'm sure there's something in your life that you can think of right now where, in gratefulness to God and in trust of His care for your future, you too can follow in Noah's footsteps and sacrifice whatever that is to God. Okay, so let's sum up where we are so far. We've seen that God enables people to obey Him when He gives them a command. And we've seen that God is faithful. Everything that He said He would do, He does. And we've seen that God remembers those that He's made promises to. He will follow through on what He says. And now we have seen that Noah, a righteous man, is somebody who walks with God, who wants to be with Him. He is somebody who obeys God. He is someone who waits on God to know what his next step is. And he's someone who gives out of his scarcity, out of gratefulness and trust in the faithfulness of God. And what next? What else can the flood teach us? Well, right after Noah has made this sacrifice and God has noticed it and said, oh, I really like what's going on here. He says, I will never again send a flood on the earth, because every man's heart from the time that he's a youth is inclined towards evil. Well, I think there's two things we can take out of there. He still had to find a way to fulfill his promise to Eve. We can't forget that. That promise to Eve is very important. And he has said, your offspring will crush the head of the serpent. And so that's got to happen. And Noah is now the way for that to happen. But that's the obvious one. What about the maybe less obvious one? I see parallels here. Abraham actually is praying to God, interceding on behalf of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, praying that God will spare them. Abraham is actually able to save the life of Lot and his family because of his prayer. I mean, God still kept his promise to judge sin. That's not going to change because God must follow through on what is in his nature, and part of his nature is holiness. So that's not going to go away. But something about that righteous man who pursues God is able to intercede on behalf of others. And Noah, in this moment of sacrifice, is like Abraham. He's able to intercede on behalf of all humanity. And what he's done, perhaps even without knowing it, is demonstrated to God that out of this wicked generation that he was part of, a righteous line could come forward. And God's saying, yes, the inclination of man is wicked from youth, but look at how Noah turned out. There's hope. There's a future. And it's not like God didn't know this, okay? It's very important that we don't take this to mean that God is somehow less than all-knowing and all-powerful. However, I think God is communicating to us an important principle of how he works with people, because he always makes a way. And he recognizes that while there is wickedness in everyone's heart, including Noah, it is possible by walking with God and trusting in God for our hearts to be changed through God's power. And so Noah is showing us this, and God is saying, because this is possible, I'm not going to wipe you all out again this way. So the next thing we see is God doing what we've already seen him do before. This is a repetition for a reason. It's how God deals with people. See, God makes a decision, and his decision is that he's going to give these people an opportunity to mature, to give them every opportunity to choose the path of righteousness instead of choosing the path of violence. He's going to make that happen. But in order to make that happen, he chooses a representative. And he makes a covenant with that representative, who is a proxy for the interaction between him and mankind. You see, that's what he did with Adam and Eve. They were his proxies. They were his priests, right? They're in the garden, and they are representing the connection that he has with all of mankind. And as part of that, they had a covenant agreement. Similarly, God makes an agreement with Noah. He's already made an agreement with Noah, right? The agreement was, get on the ark, bring all the animals, and I'll make sure you live through the flood. So that's covenant number one. But now he makes a new covenant with Noah representing all mankind and the leader of all the beasts of the field, all of the animals, everything that lives. And in that role, he says, here's how the new order is going to work. I'm not going to destroy things. I'm going to give people an opportunity for life to continue as it is. And I'm going to give you a promise. I'll give you a sign so that you know that I'm saying the truth, and I will remember and you will remember. And that is the sign of the rainbow. And signs are something God uses with every covenant agreement. The sign of the covenant agreement with Noah is the rainbow. Later on, the sign of the covenant with Abraham is circumcision. Later on, with Moses and the Israelites, that sign again is circumcision. When you get to the time of Christ, that sign is the gift of the Holy Spirit. God always provides some indicator that he's keeping his promise. He's keeping this covenant agreement. So what goes into this covenant agreement with Noah, besides the whole God won't destroy everything in the flood again? Well, thing number one, which you might find a little interesting, he says all animals, all fish, all birds, all insects, they're going to be afraid of people. In a sense, it's sort of like Genesis chapter 1, humanity has dominion over everything, but now they're just going to be afraid. So we're not really ruling over them. They're afraid. It almost sounds like a curse. But I challenge you again to remember that this is about joy coming in the morning. This is about God providing opportunity for us to pursue the right path. You see, if every inclination of man is violent, then those who are most inclined to follow those ways, were they to have easy access to all animal life all the time, what might be the result? While the Bible doesn't say that all of the violence before the flood involved violence against animals, I strongly suspect that it did. Here we're told that God is reducing the violence by sending the animals away from people. So there won't be a need for violence because the lions are going to stay out of our backyards. And there won't be as many opportunities for violence because the squirrels are going to run away from us. God, in his mercy, accounts for our weakness and provides a way of escape from the temptation. And that's a principle we hear in the New Testament. And here in the New Covenant with Noah, he's saying, I'm going to make it easier for you all to live a righteous life. I'm going to create this separation between you and the animals so it's not quite so horrible. At least that's my take on it. So what else does God do in this covenant? He says, Noah, you and your children, you're going to be fruitful. You're going to multiply. You're going to fill the earth. Just like my commands before. You're going to go ahead and make mankind spread everywhere. And the implication here is that God is speaking to his proxy. He's speaking to his representative on earth. And he's saying, you, my representative, go make more representatives. Fill the earth with more people who will follow me. It's not just about having lots of babies and populating the earth. It's all about this relationship with God thing. And so when he's giving a command to someone he's made a covenant with, he's saying, I've elected you to follow me. Now go make more followers. And isn't that what he told the Jews? And isn't that what happens in the New Testament when Jesus tells his disciples they're going to be fishers of men and later tells them that they are to go into the ends of the earth to make disciples? God always works the same way with his people. God doesn't change. We change, but God doesn't change. And in his faithfulness and in his mercy, he always provides an instruction that involves us connecting with him and connecting other people to him. There's another thing he commanded Noah. Might be a little bit interesting. So he says, oh, you get to eat animals now, which is something some people jump to say, oh, we all used to be vegetarians and we weren't supposed to eat plants before. And I don't know necessarily that you can take that leap. I think you have to read this in the context of this story, which is somewhat parallel to the original creation story. So in the original creation story, when God sets up his new order and he gives mankind dominion and says, you are to represent me, he also gives them food. Well, in this case, he's giving Noah an opportunity to fill the earth and to represent him, and he provides them with food. So in my way of looking at it, it's just God's provision for us. And it may also have some merciful component, because if we weren't supposed to eat the animals at all, well, then in this case, God's saying, I know you're going to, so I'm not going to consider it a sin if you do, which would be God extending mercy. If you do choose to believe that the original intention was that we wouldn't eat animals. And that's a subject of debate for other people. I'm more focused on what this tells us about who God is. So let's look at the last thing God says to Noah here. God says, you won't eat anything with the lifeblood of animals in it. And he says, a life for a life will be taken. If a person or an animal takes the life of a human being, that person or animal will die. Their life will be demanded of him. And that is the way of the world, right? If a dog attacks a human, that dog is put down. If a person kills another person, the punishment is severe, and in many cases involves that person's life being taken by government. This is the order that God put in place so that all of us would find the violence of taking another human life abhorrent, so that we would not have a repetition of what happened before the flood when people would just allow the violence to take over. There's some natural restraint that he gave us in his mercy, but he says, when you eat the animals, don't eat their life blood. So this becomes then a symbol. So look at the Garden of Eden. After Adam and Eve sinned and they tried to cover themselves, they were given animal skins. And so blood was shed in that moment. So that was the first symbol that we have of blood covering the sins of someone else, postponing their death, as it were. Certainly not curing it, because only the blood of Christ can do that. But it was that first foreshadowing of the blood of Christ that would eventually come. And here we have it repeated again. The lifeblood of animals. It represents the spiritual importance of blood as the breath of life from God. And so in the future, we know that blood is what provides remission of sins. It happens symbolically with the sacrificial system of the Israelite religion. And then it happens again in full fulfillment with Jesus. So there's something very important here about that lifeblood. It refers to God's ultimate plan. So let's just sum up this beautiful picture that we have here, shall we? We have a God who is faithful and keeps all of his promises. We have a God who can be trusted to remember people after he has asked them to obey. We have a God who is holy and who cannot tolerate sin, and yet is merciful and provides a way for us to get to know him, gives us an opportunity to connect with him, and is patient because he knows that in every generation there is an opportunity for people to connect with him the way Noah connected with him. And he gives us this example in Noah of a righteous man, someone that we can aspire to be like because he walked with God and he trusted God and he obeyed God. You see, the flood is not just about God's judgment. It is about God's judgment. And as we mentioned last time, that judgment can be escaped through one path. And the ark was that path in the flood, and Jesus is that path in the future judgment. But despite the fact that there is judgment and that the flood definitely shows that, I just want you to think about what it tells us about God's faithfulness and his mercy and the way that he works with people. Because you see, the same God who made an agreement with Noah that mankind would not be wiped out by a flood again, and that there would be an opportunity for them to get to know him the way Noah got a chance to get to know him. That same God who put a rainbow in the sky to remember this promise and to prove to Noah that he would always keep his promises. That same God is our God. He's the one looking at the rainbows in the sky today. And this doesn't mean there were no rainbows before the flood. That's kind of scientifically ludicrous, and I'm not saying it. What I'm saying is that God used that to say, look, this is going to come over and over and over again. I wrote it into my universe. And when you look up and you see this thing that I wrote into my universe, you remember that I am faithful and I am merciful and I made a way for you to connect with me. Because that is what the flood tells us about God.